Mr. Hardy. Welcome back from lunch.
Good afternoon, thanks.
I want to start with your air emissions testimony from, it appears to be ages ago. CLF filed a motion in this action where it asserted that your calculations of air emissions were based on Invenergy having a capacity supply obligation for all 1,000 megawatts of its project, and therefore being obligated to offer energy every hour of the year and then actually clearing many hours of the year. CLF's position in that motion, therefore, that because Invenergy does not have a CSO for either turbine and does not have an obligation to offer energy into the ISO market, there is, quote, no basis in the record for Mr. Hardy's testimony pertaining to air emissions, close quote. So first couple of questions. Were your air emissions projections for Clear River in fact calculated based on the premise that Invenergy must offer energy in all 8,760 hours?
No, it is true that when a facility has a CSO, it is required to offer energy all hours that it's available, which could potentially be 8,760. The basis of my air emissions analysis is an economic analysis of the Clear River facility offering its energy into the ISO New England market and operating when it is economic to do so. The emissions reductions that are in my testimony are based on, and I think we talked about this earlier, a capacity factor or a generation profile that is around 60–65% in terms of a capacity factor. That's the basis of my air emissions analysis.
And second then, were your projections calculated based on the premise that Clear River must possess a capacity supply obligation?
No. So a capacity supply obligation deals completely with the clearing an FCA and deals with the capacity side of things. Separately, to the extent that Clear River is constructed and operates in the energy market, offering the energy in and dispatching in the energy market is where the emissions reductions are driven from. So the energy market operations are essentially separate and distinct from a CSO or capacity supply obligation.
So does Clear River actually need to possess a CSO to achieve the emission reductions?
It does not. It only needs to be online and operating.
And am I correct that you and your company, Paid Consultant, provided all of your assumptions and the results supporting your calculations of the emission reductions to the town, to the Office of Energy Resources, and given who raised this issue, to CLF?
That's correct.
All right. You were asked a number of questions yesterday by Mr. Elmer, and in a somewhat gentler fashion, similar questions today by Mr. McElroy. All of them basically addressing the point that in FCA 10, your forecast that both units would clear the auction was quote-unquote wrong. In FCA 11 and FCA 12, and in FCA 13, your forecast that Unit 2 would clear were wrong. First of all, could you explain why your analysis forecast that Unit 2 would clear all three auctions?
Sure. So, and I think we kind of made this distinction yesterday. In my analysis, at different time periods, it was my assumption that Clear River Unit 2 would qualify to participate in the respective auctions. Now, it was qualified to participate in FCA 10, and it did not clear, but in FCA, in subsequent FCAs, when the facility was not qualified to participate, that was information that was not available at the time that I made my forecast. So I think it is, and even going forward in my testimony that shows Clear River 1 and 2 clearing FCA 14, it is based on the assumption that Clear River will be available to available to participate in FCA 14. And if it is, then it is my assumption that it will clear FCA 14.
And focusing specifically on FCA 11 and 12, your assumption again was, if I understand it correctly, that Unit 2 would be allowed to participate in the auction, correct?
That's correct.
And 13.
Correct.
Right. And certainly we know for 12 and 13, Unit 2 has been disqualified from the auction, correct?
That's correct.
That is something you did not anticipate.
Correct.
All right. And are you aware of the reason with respect to FCA 12 and 13 why ISO New England disqualified Unit 2?
So, as a result of Clear River Unit 1 clearing FCA 10, the ISO puts the facility on what's called critical path scheduling. I think that's a pretty applicable term because I think it shows, again, the importance of all megawatts that clear a capacity auction. So critical path scheduling is basically, the way that I would describe it is the ISO monitors the schedule of the plant to make sure that it will meet its online date. So as a result of Unit 1 clearing FCA 10, it was on critical path scheduling, which essentially puts Unit 2 by default on critical path scheduling. So as a result, when that was reviewed, the ISO determined that the plant had not made sufficient progress such that the Unit 2 would be allowed to participate in FCA 12.
And when you talk about sufficient progress, you mean sufficient progress with respect to either getting through the permitting process or doing what was necessary to be able to establish that it would meet the capacity supply obligation date.
That's correct.
I'm not sure if I caught the date on your question, but what was the reason Unit 2 didn't clear FCA 10?
I'm not sure. I guess that is probably a better question for Invenergy.
Okay, but you just answered the question on why it didn't clear FCA 11.
Actually, 12 and 13,
12.
because they couldn't participate. So maybe if I take a step back, the way that we approach it is we first start with the assumption that the facility would be able to participate in the forward capacity auction. We then, look at the supply-demand balance in the market and what we expect the clearing price to be without the project and with the project, and if the project is competitive enough to offer its capacity in at a price that would allow it to clear. So I guess the way that I would determine it is we're looking at it from an economic basis, based on pure economics. So that doesn't necessarily take into account, for example, and this is conjecture on my part, if you look at FCA 11. Going into FCA 11, I think it was already clear that there were some permitting and schedule delays. Did that factor into Invenergy's willingness to bid in Unit 2 at a particular price? Did they put an additional risk premium on it? I can't say for sure. Potentially that in my opinion, that is one of the factors that probably contributed. I'm not party to the strategic discussions that go around offering that capacity, and so I can't say that for sure. But I think that is part of probably the mindset. If we look at it on a pure economic basis, it's our view that both units, could have cleared FCA 10, Clear River 2 could have cleared FCA 11, and 12 and 13 if they were allowed to participate. And it's also our view that the entire facility can clear FCA 14 again if it is qualified to participate.
Thank you. Going back to FCA 10, what did you forecast the clearing price to be before it was actually announced?
Our forecast clearing price was $7 a kilowatt month.
And what did the clearing price end up being for FCA 10?
It was $7.03 a kilowatt month.
Do you have this document? It's Mr. Elmer's, what you refer to as his demonstrative.
I do.
All right, and he asked you a number of questions about this thing yesterday. So I want to start with FCA 10 in 2016. And he has here Invenergy in auction, and again, that's unit 1.
Correct.
In the auction. Clears at 703, you forecast at 7, but that reflects a year-over-year reduction from the prior year of $10.70 per kilowatt month, correct? Kilowatt hour, correct?
Kilowatt month.
Kilowatt month, excuse me, correct?
Correct.
Yes, he reflects a drop of 61%. Do you have an opinion on why that occurred?
Part of the reason for that reduction was, a large part of the reason was the clearing of new generation capacity. There were 3 facilities that cleared that auction: Bridgeport Harbor, Canal, and Clay River. And each of those had a pretty significant impact on the resulting capacity price reduction.
All right. And then we get to FCA 11 in 2017, and when Mr. Elmer has here, Invenergy fails to clear, that was Unit 2, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Unit 1 was in FCA 11.
That's correct, as a price taker.
And could you explain what a price taker is?
Sure. So, as a result of clearing FCA 10, Clear River Unit 1 received, or had the ability to receive, a 7-year capacity supply obligation, which they elected to enter into. As a result, the ISO then considers that capacity as part of the existing supply for that 7-year period. So in that subsequent auction, Clear River 1 did not have to offer its capacity in as a price. It simply entered in at essentially a zero price. So that capacity will clear regardless of what the clearing price is.
Just to make sure, because it's already in.
Essentially, yes.
While it is already in, because it participates in the auction as a price taker at 0, does that participation at 0 have an impact on the clearing price?
Yes, and we talked a bit about this yesterday. It's sort of, at the end of the day, all of the megawatts that clear FCA 11 are essentially part of that package that results in that clearing price. So, all else equal, the less supply, the potential for the price to clear higher. The more supply that clears, the potential for it to clear lower. So, as being part of the megawatts that cleared, whether it's offering a new capacity or as a price taker, it does have an impact on the resulting price.
You mentioned earlier today some parties, like I believe you mentioned Cogentrix, who were complaining to FERC about the fact that Clear River's presence in the auction was, I believe your statement was suppressing prices. Did I quote you correctly?
Yes.
All right. What do you mean by that?
So Cogentrix claim was that,
Did you say what Cogentrix is?
So Cogentrix is an owner-operator of power generation facilities, and they own megawatts within ISO New England. So from a generator's perspective, you could argue that they would like to see capacity prices clear higher, because that would be more revenue for their facilities. So as part of the overall process of the ISO in their tariff of reviewing whether or not to terminate Clear River CSO, they opened that up to commentary from stakeholders. Cogentrix was one of the stakeholders that filed comments, and part of their comments said that this plant is not going to meet its online date. By leaving that capacity in, it's suppressing prices, lowering overall capacity. You would agree with that?
And then moving to FCA 12, you recall that there was a similar effort by other energy companies in the industry to convince ISO and ultimately FERC to not allow Clear River to participate in FCA 12 as a price taker.
That's correct.
And you recall, for example, Exelon and LS Power made the same argument that Clear River's presence was artificially suppressing clearing prices.
That's correct.
Mr. Hart, given what you said before, kind of about supply and price, so am I to assume that supply is increasing because the price has been going down successively, 15, SCA 9, 10, 11, 12?
Partially. Part of it has been that supply has increased. Part of it is also that demand has decreased. So, overall, we kind of always have to look at both sides of it. It's supply and demand, and demand has fallen. So, that's certainly part of the reason.
Makes sense.
Prices have fallen. The other part actually that does play into this as well is the ISO determines the parameters for the demand curve. So basically the parameters of that demand curve are set around, ultimately, at a target point, say at net ICR, the point on the demand curve where it would intersect supply should roughly should match what a new unit should require from, what their view from a generic basis of what that new unit should require. I don't know the exact timing of it, but over subsequent auctions, their parameters have shifted downward, which all else equal means with the same supply and the same demand, you would see a lower clearing price because their view of those economics has moved down.
I don't want to derail this, but so it might be something to set aside, but I'm trying to figure out in my head on that curve how the surplus fits in.
Okay.
And if this isn't the right time for this.
I think it's probably, I was going to ask about that too, so.
So I think I can point you
I
to.
feel like you had a chart
And
in your
so,
testimony.
and this is, even though ISO New England is not intentionally trying to acquire surplus in excess of the install capacity requirement, as a function of the demand curve, they might end up acquiring it simply because of where supply meets demand.
In a way, yes. I mean, ultimately, they're running a complex algorithm that is looking at, what is the optimal solution, and they are always going to attempt to procure at least the net ICR. That's the minimum amount that can be required. There is no maximum. Now, we haven't seen them procure 5 gigawatts above net ICR, but I think if you look at, and it was one of the data requests which we'll provide, if you look at recent auctions, it has been, on average, 1,200 megawatts above net ICR, which has, and that's where the clearing prices has come up. And I was just going to flip to. So if you have the Invenergy application, which is, I guess it's Exhibit 1A, that we were looking at yesterday, on page 117.
Could you put that up on the screen? Thanks.
So this is the graph, and again, this is a simplified example, but I mean, ultimately, it shows, if you look at the intersection, so if you take your microphone with you.
Portable mic. No easy way to do that.
I'm thinking this is portable, but I guess it is. So if you look at the clearing price at, this would be total capacity in the market. If you look at where the price clears at 34,500 megawatts, it's 1150. With an additional 2 gigawatts of capacity, the price falls to $2.50. So that illustration is meant to show with more capacity, and obviously with less capacity, the price will continue to rise.
And you said earlier, whether it's surplus or whether it's a proposed plant, it doesn't really matter, a megawatt's a megawatt. But as you increase that bundle, the price goes down.
That's correct.
So it's been asked multiple times, but you've forecast that both Clear River units, if allowed to participate, would clear FCA 14 in February of 2020, correct?
That's correct.
If supply is up and demand is down, why do you forecast that both units will clear?
So, again, when you look at supply relative to demand, there is an argument that can be made that they're absent what your view is on retirements. So let's take potential retirements off the board. If nothing retires, there's a good chance that there will be sufficient capacity for FCA 14 to meet net ICR. But there is still the opportunity for Clear River to clear in that auction at a price that will be economic for them to do so. In addition, there is a benefit in the market for generation that is new, efficient, and a lower emitting resource that will come into the market and displace older, less efficient, higher polluting assets. So, it's more than just a simple supply-demand calculation of saying we may potentially have 1 megawatt more than what is needed in the market. And I think the FCA process over time has shown that net ICR is not the maximum amount of capacity that the ISO is attempting to purchase, it's the minimum. And there are benefits related to need outside directly of the FCA process that Clear River brings. And a big part of that, and this has been echoed in PUC advisory opinions in the past, is having new generation that is clean and efficient come in and displace older, less efficient, higher polluting resources is a benefit in the market. It's a benefit for lower energy prices, which passes directly through to rates. It's a benefit in lower emissions, which helps Rhode Island and New England meet its emission reduction targets. So there are multiple benefits to be considered. It's more than just a simple supply-demand calculation.
Just cut out an entire page of my follow-up questions.
Apologies.
No, don't apologize. Here's very much the billion-dollar question. Your position, your opinion, your opinion previously was that clearing the forward capacity auction and having a CSO is strong evidence of need.
Yes.
Is that still your opinion?
Yes.
But Clear River, as we've heard ad nauseum in this proceeding over the last day and a half, no longer has a CSO.
Correct.
But it's still your opinion that both units of Clear River are still needed as need is defined under the Energy Facility Siting Act, correct?
Correct.
Let's look at the bubble. It's your December submittal. It's page 21. And I believe this is a graphic representation, as confusing as it may appear, of what you were just saying a few moments ago. So, see figure 1 there? Figure 1, relative efficiency of Clear River, of CREC versus New England thermal fleet? Yes, there it is up on the screen. All right. I don't think this is a Rorschach test, so could you explain for us what this is?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, you're correct. I mean, this was our best attempt to graphically illustrate this concept of Clear River with its, being a new and efficient and lower emitting resource, how that stacks up to what the existing supply mix looks like in New England. So what you have here is on the y-axis is heat rate. Heat rate is the relative efficiency of a thermal plant. So how efficient is it in converting natural gas into power? So all else equal, the higher the heat rate, the less efficient it is, the more gas it needs to burn to produce a megawatt of power, and the more CO2 it will emit because it's burning more gas to produce that megawatt of power. So all else equal, the lower the heat rate, the more efficient that it is. On the x-axis is the age, and this is presented as the age in 2024, which would be the first full year of CREC operations. That's the age of the power plants, thermal power plants in New England. Lastly, the one other metric is the size of the circles. The size of the circle is a relative mark of how much CO2 is emitted by that plant to produce a megawatt of power. So all else equal, the larger the circle, the more higher emitting of a power plant it is to produce a megawatt of power. A few things to note here. As you can see, a significant amount of the generation fleet in New England is aging, is 40 years or older. A significant amount of the fleet has a much larger circumference of its circle, meaning it's a higher emitting resource. So we've shown that relative to Clear River and also other planned generators in the market. And so that's what's represented here. So as you can see, Clear River, from a relative perspective, would be new, lower emitting, lower heat rate, highly efficient asset. So when you talk about this, I think we talked a lot about it during the air emissions testimony is, well, if that plant comes online, will it emit CO2? Yes, it will, but it does so much more efficiently and displaces your assets that are in the larger circles, and particularly some of the more older assets. That's what this figure represents.
So in this figure, you'll have to take the part of the mic with you again. Could you just identify up on the screen there where Clear River is?
Sure. Clear River is the small yellow circle here.
And could you explain again, please, what does that mean relative to the other circles on this figure?
So the fact that it is a smaller circle means that for every megawatt of power that it produces less CO2 emissions than any circle that is larger. And in terms of heat rate, which is on the y-axis, the lower it is on the axis means that its ability to convert natural gas into power is as efficient or more efficient than anything else that's currently in the market.
And there certainly isn't as efficient, but it looks like there's another one, it looks like it's green immediately to the right of the Clear River dot, correct?
That's correct.
Do you have any idea which
I believe that's footprint.
Where would like Manchester Street Station be? Is that too hard to answer? I'm just trying to visualize.
No, it's a good question. I do have the backup of all of this that has all of the plant names, so I could easily identify it for you.
Should we make that a record request? Number 15. Identify Manchester Street Station.
Give you all the backup if you'd like.
Sure. The backup for figure 1 in,
Is that at 37?
which is the third supplemental adjustment. Thank you.
The last thing I would point out on this graph, which I think is interesting, is we've shown the gray bubbles are the ones that that are retired or out of service, which, as you would expect, is more of your older, less efficient resources. Commingled in that group are a number of assets that the ISO identifies as at risk, and those are plants that, again, while we haven't necessarily retired all of those as part of our analysis, or majority of those, we do see them very much at risk and agree with the ISO that they are. And you can see that they have a very similar profile in terms of their age and efficiency.
There's been some discussion about,
There's been some discussion about Mystic 8 and 9, and the fact that it is receiving a cost of service agreement valued at approximately $400 million. Could you explain what that's all about?
Sure. So ultimately, Exelon, the owner of Mystic 8 and 9, had indicated to the ISO that that those plants were not recovering essentially their costs on a going forward basis, and that they were planning to retire them, and they had submitted various delist bids or retirement requests in some form. The ISO identified those plants as I'm going to paraphrase their words, but identified them as necessary for fuel security. And so, basically there was a series of filings with FERC. The first one was rejected by FERC with some with a recommendation on what to come back with, and ultimately the ISO had put a cost of service, essentially a 2-year cost of service agreement in place with Mystic 8 and 9. FERC approved, I believe it is a 2-year agreement with a third year, an option for a third year to extend that cost of service. And FERC's approval of that, they again, I'm paraphrasing, they basically said that they expect that over this period of time, this 2 to 3 year period of time, that the ISO will put the proper market construct in place to compensate fuel security attributes, so that they were not planning on extending past those 3 years. So ultimately, the ISO will need to figure out a market construct for fuel security so that a cost of service agreement is not required.
So, and this cost of service agreement will compensate Exelon to the extent of approximately $400 million, is that correct?
Approximately $400 million, that's correct.
And where's that money coming from?
That comes directly from the ratepayers.
And again, I believe you said it, this is a temporary fix,
Yes,
so it will get Mystic through FCA 13 and 14 with an option for 15? Is that
That's correct.
And that's it?
that's correct.
And your understanding is that FERC has directed ISO to develop a long-term market solution to the fuel security issue, and that it will no longer accept interim solutions, correct?
That's my opinion, yes.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if you made this clear or not in testimony. If you did, sorry to ask you again, but the reason for the retirement we're talking about with Mystic, that it's just not economic for them to run, and so to continue operating under regular circumstances, they would not be making any money.
That's correct.
And so following up on Chairperson's current question, the $400 million is intended to compensate Exelon for what it perceived as the uneconomic way that its facilities were going to operate, and therefore why it was going to close them, correct?
Correct.
My notes are all over the place, so forgive me. If you could go to page 10 of your December 14 submission.
Okay.
And I can't remember if it was Mr. Elmer or Mr. McElroy, but one of them asked you questions here. This is about the question and the answer relating to, apart from a facility having a CSO, the other three principal bases for your opinion that Clear River is needed. Do you see that? Page 10, starting at line 11, the question and the following answer.
Yes.
Okay. And could you explain what those bases are and why you still believe that Clear River Units 1 and 2 are still needed?
Sure. So absent the CSO, and there were a number of factors, 3 of them are listed here, that I believe are still true even absent the CSO. One is that there's a significant amount of capacity that's still at risk, more capacity at risk at the time of the 2018 SELF report than there was at the 2016 report. And I think that was as evident in the figure we were looking at earlier. The second is that Rhode Island continues to be part of an import-constrained zone, which is CENI. It is true that capacity price for CENI has not separated in the last couple auctions, but the ISO continues and has for upcoming FCA 13 determined CENI to be an import-constrained zone.
Let me stop you there for a second, because we've heard that phrase import-constrained quite a bit here. Could you explain what that means in the context of the Southeast New England zone?
Sure. I mean, at the highest level, it means that in the ISO's determination to satisfy the net ICR for CENI, they need to rely on imports from outside of the CENI zone. And there is the potential that the transmission capabilities, so the lines that will transfer electrons into the CENI zone, may be insufficient to satisfy net ICR.
So it's a physical constraint.
It's a physical constraint, that's correct.
It's not an economic constraint.
That's correct.
Sorry, I cut you off on your last answer.
And the last one is that capacity above the NICR is still needed. That's something that, we've seen capacity historically clear above net ICR. The ISO and other stakeholders have talked about the benefits of capacity clearing above the net ICR. The PUC in advisory opinions has talked about the benefits of clearing capacity above the net ICR. And we continue to believe that that is a very relevant characteristic of the market.
Let's go to page 14, starting at the top, line 2. But before we go there, I want to ask you a lead-in question. Mr. Elmer asked you in a number of different ways yesterday a question about the outcome of Clear River Unit 1's participation in the annual reconfiguration auctions in 2017 and 2018. Do you recall that?
Yes.
All right. Now, that reconfiguration auction process is part of the ISO New England tariff, correct?
That's correct.
What is the tariff?
The tariff is part of the market rules that basically give direction to how the ISO operates the capacity market, both the FCA and the corresponding reconfiguration options.
And I believe it was Mr. McElroy this morning who used the phrase gaming the system. Is that what the reconfiguration auction is?
No, the reconfiguration auction is, and I think I said this yesterday, is essentially meant to true up differences in capacity and load that may occur from the time that the FCA clears, 3 years in advance, to the time when the delivery year commences.
Now let's go back to what I just focused you on, which is page 14, starting at line 2. And you point out here that in FCA 10 and 11, Clear River Unit 1's capacity contributed to a lower capacity price than if it had not participated, and that's because it was a price taker, correct? Well, at least not in 10, but in 11 it did.
Correct.
Correct. All right. Now, you don't include its impact in FCA 12 here. So we're just looking at FCA 10 and 11, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And it's, if I read this correctly, well, here, you say it, by participating in these two auctions, Clear River will save Rhode Island ratepayers approximately $39 million. Could you explain how that happens?
Sure. So the way that we calculate this $39 million is we look at the clearing price with Clear River 1 in FCA 10 and 11, and then what the resulting price would be if Clear River did not clear FCA 10 or participate or essentially clear in FCA 11. That difference in capacity price is then applied only to Rhode Island's share of New England load, which is about 6% of total New England load. So this 39 million, to be clear, is just ratepayer savings for customers in the state of Rhode Island.
We'll get to that other part in a minute.
Okay.
I'd like to hear the explanation of how, and particularly because this sentence seems to be forward-looking. It says it will save.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to understand how it is, why it is that since Clear River has already participated in these auctions, why this statement is forward-looking, that savings, you seem to be saying the savings will occur in the future.
In the future, that's correct. Because ultimately, so, FCA 10 dealt with the cost for capacity that will essentially impact wholesale power costs and resulting rates for 2019. And actually, as it relates to rates, there may even be a bit of a lag on that. It could be 19, potentially 20. So to give an example, if we go back to a couple of years ago in the polar vortex, during the polar vortex, extreme winter weather, power prices spiked, and the impact on rates really happened the next year. The next year there was this rate increase, and that was the pass-through of the costs associated with that. So there always is a bit of a lag on what you'd actually see in your monthly electricity bill. So while this capacity price has already cleared and it's already happened and we can estimate the impact, we say we'll save because it's the wholesale power costs really for the capability year beginning June 2019 through May 2020, which probably impacts rates in 2021, to be exact. So there's always a bit of a lag on when it actually impacts. But at the highest level, this capacity participating in this forward capacity auction contributed to lower capacity prices, which contributes to lower ratepayer costs.
So this 39 million, if I understand you correctly, obviously it's just for Rhode Island.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, ASO New England includes a number of states as we've established. And I believe you said that, first of all, it is, at least with FCA 11, this is a function of what other competitors call price suppression. It's a function of Clear River being a price taker.
Yes.
So the number's going to be higher if you plug in FCA 12, presumably, correct?
Presumably, yes.
All right. But just focusing on your $39 million number here, Rhode Island, you said, represents approximately 6% of the entire ISO New England region. Is that correct?
In terms of load, that's correct.
What do you mean in terms of load?
In terms of peak demand. So the capacity market, the capacity price is based on net ICR, which is effectively peak demand, and that's for all of New England. Rhode Island's share of that cost and load is about 6%.
So if we, and I'm not going to do the math, that's why I went to law school, but if we carry out that $39 million over the entire ISO New England region, again, not even taking into account FCA 12, how much will Clear River's presence in those two auctions have saved ratepayers in ISO New England?
I believe it's over 600 million.
Just have saved, so that has happened regardless of what happens in this process.
Correct.
And then another question on your model, I assume when you're looking at the world without CREC 1 in, so then you're looking at what would have been the next facility that would have grabbed up that 500 megawatts. So it's not like, is that how you're looking at it?
It could be another facility. In some cases, that if you pull CREC out, it clears at a different price. There's not necessarily a substitute megawatt that comes in.
I'm just trying to, so your model is, it's not as simplistic as a world with it and a world without it. You're looking at what would have happened if it wasn't there.
That's correct.
Okay.
Could you go to, so before we do that, to be fair with respect to the Killingly issue, Exelon is getting $400 million from ISO New England ratepayers.
Sorry, Mystic.
No, yeah. Mystic, yeah, definitely not Killingly. Mystic is going to be getting approximately $400 million from ISO New England ratepayers. But I think it's been established as a result of this cost of service agreement, Mystic will also be participating in at least the next two auctions, 13 and 14, as a price taker as well, correct?
That's correct.
At zero.
Correct.
So its presence in those two auctions will have an effect, I don't want to say similar to, but of the same type as Clear River's presence in the prior two auctions, correct?
Correct.
All right. Let's go to page 19 then of your December pre-filed. Starting at line 5. Well, first of all, the question is in line 3, do you expect ratepayer savings beyond 2026? And then you answer, yes, in my opinion, there will be continued ratepayer savings well beyond 2026, as CREC will continue to displace less efficient and more costly generation in the energy and capacity markets. So I think we understand what the capacity market is. That's the whole forward capacity construct that ISO governs, correct?
Correct.
What is the energy market?
So I think the best way to think about CREC's impact on the energy market is, going back to the figure that we showed earlier with the circles and the relative efficiency is CREC's presence in terms of offering its energy in, at a heat rate that is in the low 6,000s, its ability to convert gas into power at an extremely efficient, at or better than any of the facilities that are currently operating in the market, that translates into an overall lower energy price. So its presence in the market will lower energy prices because it's going to displace higher cost resources. And that benefit translates into lower energy prices and energy cost savings for ratepayers.
And we understand that Clear River has to have a CSO in order to participate in the forward capacity auction for purposes of the capacity market. Does Clear River need a capacity supply obligation in order to participate in the energy market?
It does not.
Are you familiar with something called the ancillary market?
Yes.
What is the ancillary market?
So ancillaries is all, outside of energy, there's a number of products, responsive reserves, and other products that help in front of the ISO from a standpoint of keeping the market reliable, voltage support, black start, all of those are in a bucket of ancillary services that are provided by resources that operate in the energy market.
And does Clear River or any other resource need a capacity supply obligation to participate in the ancillary market?
They do not.
Just a question back on the price. So if the scenario that Mr. Blazer is painting for us would be not being part of an FCA, not having a CSO, but nonetheless getting a license and operating, how would that affect price and savings to ratepayers?
It would be, the ratepayer savings as I've calculated them would be lower. I mean, essentially, if they're not going to participate in the capacity auction, then the capacity savings would not be realized. Now, they could choose to operate in the energy market and then clear some future capacity auction. So it doesn't completely wipe out the potential for them to have an impact on the forward capacity market, even if they decide to build the plant without clearing that first one. But to the extent that they don't participate in the capacity market, then there are no capacity savings.
But following up on that, can a resource that is existing and operating participate in the annual reconfiguration auction if it doesn't have a capacity supply obligation?
Yes.
So, Clear.
In that case, though, the price paid, that could have figured what happened with you. The set price is what the ratepayer's paying, and then the differential is something that the generator or potential generator is getting.
Correct.
Flipping over to Mr. McElroy now, I think, at least that's what my notes say. I want to ask you just a question about that email that was part of Exhibit 151. I think it was an email from you to Mr. Nyland.
Yes.
Do you have that one around there somewhere?
I had it yesterday. I have it.
Okay. And Mr. McElroy was asking you questions, I think, trying to figure out whether what you said in this email was your opinion or something else. And to me, it came out unclear. Could you explain what this email here is and what you were doing?
Sure. So after, I believe after Clear River Unit 2 had been denied to participate in the forward capacity auction, Mr. Nyland was going to have a meeting with ISO New England to talk about a variety of things, including the whole process of permitting versus participating in an FCA. He asked me to put together some talking points or questions that he could bring up with the ISO as part of that discussion. So this email here, and this is something that we're routinely asked by clients, is to provide some thoughts or some questions or talking points to help for a particular discussion. That's what this email represents.
So is it in fact your opinion that without a CSO, this board can't grant a permit for Clear River?
Absolutely not.
But we do know, we're not going to get into Killingly with you, but we do know that the Connecticut Siting Council did deny the Killingly facility's application, specifically because it didn't have a CSO, correct?
Correct.
But that's Connecticut, that's not Rhode
Yes.
Island. Got a really almost unintelligible jumble of notes here, but they all seem to go around the same thing. A lot of discussion over the last day and a half about the forward capacity auction, capacity, reliability, need as it relates to reliability, system need, resource adequacy needs. Those appear to me to be all concepts relating to the ISO New England forward capacity market. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right. Is there a distinction, in your opinion, between that and need for purposes of the Rhode Island Energy Facility siting?
Yes, and I think this kind of comes back to the theme of clearing an FCA and having a CSO is a clear indication of need. But the capacity market, the forward capacity auction, the annual reconfiguration auction, all part of the capacity side of things, is only one element of the market. It's a strong element of the market. It deals with forward planning and reliability. But this whole concept that we've talked about, the impact of bringing new and efficient generation into the market to displace older, less efficient, higher polluting, that's all part of the energy market. The concept of bringing in a generation that will help keep a market running reliably as renewables continue to enter the market at a rapid pace is really more on the energy side of things. And those are tangible elements of need that are bigger than or outside of just focusing on the forward capacity market or just focusing on reliability need or the other concepts that you mentioned.
Speaking of the forward capacity market, this confuses me as much as it might other people. Because when we're dealing with an FCA, with a forward capacity auction, we have 1 year, 3 years, and 7 years. So it's a 7-year capacity supply obligation, a price lock, correct?
Correct.
In a 3-year look ahead.
Correct.
And the forward capacity auction occurs on a yearly basis.
Yes, for a 1 year, essentially a 1 year term, although there is the option for a
Right.
7-year lock. That's correct.
To the best of your ability, could you, in plain English, explain how that works? The 1 year, the 3 year, the 7 year.
Sure. So
I should take my glasses off too for this one.
So the forward capacity auction is clearing, is looking at, it's basically planning 3 years ahead. So it's looking at what is our demand, what's the demand going to be 3 years from now, and what is the supply going to be 3 years from now for that 12-month period beginning 3 years from now.
If I can stop you there for a moment, is that why, for example, with FCA 10, which occurred in 2016, the capacity commitment was as of May 31 of 2019?
Yeah, I think of it as June 1, 2019.
June 1, that's
Sure.
fine.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
please continue.
That's correct. So it's a 3 year look ahead, and that's not the way that all markets do it. PJM does it 3 years ahead. New York does it. Does a spot auction. So everybody does it a little bit. There is certainly benefits of doing it 3 years ahead, and they do it for 1 year.
And so wait, so first, ISO New England, who controls this market under, and they are under FERC in terms of getting essentially permission for all of the stuff
That's correct. So if they want to make any changes to the schedule or to the tariffs or anything like that, they need to present that to FERC for approval. That's correct.
And so the first step that ISO New England takes before an annual forward capacity auction, they meet with all the stakeholders, including you, to figure out what they want to acquire and what they need in the upcoming auction.
Yes.
And so they're essentially once they figure that out, then they're basically putting out a call to generators. That we need this much. Let's figure out what you're willing to take for supplying it.
Yes, and there even outside of that, there are a number of steps that lead up. So, the next auction, FCA 13, which would be from the capability period starting in 2022, there's a number of steps leading up to that. They take in delist bids. So any generator that is looking to exit the market can submit a static delist bid to the ISO.
And what does delist actually stand for?
It basically means this is the price at which I would like to remove my generator from the market. So a simple example would be if a plant were to submit a delist bid of $6 a kilowatt month, what they're signaling to the ISO is, because the way they run the auction is they keep this from going into the weeds, but they essentially start at a high price and go through rounds to move it down until they reach a clearing price. So it's almost opposite the way that some other markets do it. Instead of starting at a high price and moving up, they start at a high price and move down. So if you submit a delist price of $6, you're saying to the ISO, if the price goes below $6, I'm out. I can't make money below $6. I don't want to remain in the market. Now, the ISO doesn't have to accept that bid. They can review the bid, they can review the economics around it, they can reject it, they can potentially change it. So it's a process. So that's an important part of it as it relates to retirements. And then they run that forward capacity auction for 1 year. I think the challenging part from a planning perspective, especially as it relates to need or long-term need, is ultimately, even though a new generator can clear the market and receive a 7-year CSO, and 7 years is great because for a new generator, having that price lock for 7 years certainly helps with financing. It helps because it gives you some cash flow security that is bankable in the market. The challenge for long-term need is, let's just say, for example, that Clear River is needed, that we would all agree that Clear River is going to be needed from 2024 for the next 20 years. Maybe the way supply-demand works out or the way things clear, it's not needed in 2023. So it doesn't clear 23, but then it could clear 24. So it's still a 1-year auction. It's still a 1-year look at determining need, even though you have the option to extend past that. And that goes for all the assets. And that goes for retirement decisions as well. And we deal with this day in and day out, not only in New England, but in all markets when we're trying to look at the economics of facilities. Just because a facility is going to lose money in 1 year doesn't mean it's going to retire. Because maybe it thinks, any business is like, oh, we could withstand 1 year of losing money because we think things are going to turn around. We could withstand 2 years of losing money. But at some point, if we don't feel like we're going to make money, we're going to retire. The same is true on making the decision to enter the market as well. So there's a challenge there. That's a challenge for capacity that's looking to exit the market, and capacity that's going to enter the market. Ultimately, these are 1-year auctions that drive, a decision, a long-term decision, a long-term need.
I want to make sure we covered it before I go high. Okay. We finished that discussion with the phrase long-term need. What's your definition of long-term need?
My definition, I'm not sure that I would put a particular time period on it, but I think it is definitely greater than 1 year. It's definitely many years, and I think it's looking, again, not just at, while clearing an FCA, as I think we've covered in detail, is a clear determinant of need. There is no doubt about that. It is a 1-year look, and I think, from a reliability, from an economic, from an environmental perspective, you have to look at the future of the market over many years and look at the attributes or the benefits or the risks associated with any investment over a multitude of years. And I think different investors and different power plant owners, probably banks that are financing, they take a different outlook on what that long term is, but it's many years for sure.
And plants like this, especially these new ones with the brand new GE turbines, would you agree that their potential lifespan is purely theoretical, certainly measured in decades?
Yes.
You mentioned PJM and NISO, New England Independent System Operator. Those are two other, obviously, system operators like ISO New England, correct?
Correct.
NISO is just New York.
Yes.
PJM is 15 states,
It's, 13, potentially 16 states. Yeah,
but including Pennsylvania, obviously.
that's correct.
Do either one of those have a 7-year price lock system like New England does?
They do not.
Do you know what PJM's market construct is?
For the most part, and we've worked on a number of projects in PJM. For the most part, it is a 1-year obligation. There is part of the rules potentially allow for that to be extended to 3 years, although we haven't seen it. We haven't seen a 3-year commitment on any new generation. It's primarily a 1-year obligation.
And what about New York? And New York ISO is just limited to New York, right?
Yeah, the most that you can clear your obligation in New York, the most that you can clear in advance is 6 months.
And in PJM in particular, since you've testified that you've had experience in that market, have new combined cycle gas plants had any difficulty in obtaining financing?
No, there's been many gigawatts of projects that have been developed and financed over the last 5 years.
For example, one of those is Energy's Lackawanna project,
Correct.
1,500 megawatts.
Correct.
This might be impossible to answer. So why is New England so different from New York? Is it that we're more concerned about reliability and the long, what do you make of that? I think you're pointing out how different the length of the commitments are. Who does the benefit accrue to have a 7-year price lock?
I think the 7-year price lock, I think, benefits all stakeholders because new development is inherently complicated and can be challenging to finance. Now, in the past few years, I would say it's been easier for plants to get financed. The debt markets have just been more liquid. The cost of capital has been pretty low, so that's helped. I think when system operators like New England are considering changes to the tariffs and considering changes to rules, they're trying to look at the long term. So having that 7-year lock really makes that market, in a sense, the ability to bring in new generation. In PJM, because PJM is 3 years forward looking and it's only a 1-year market, PJM is a bit of a different market. There you have assets that are located around the Marcellus Shale that can get access to very, very cheap gas. So they've kind of signaled the willingness to move forward without having that 7-year lock, and they also have the ability to put long-term hedges in place. So absent having that capacity lock, they'll put something in place that's a financial instrument that will give them some price certainty in order to get financed. So they're using that market and what's available to them to create, an investment thesis that can get financed.
I actually don't have much left. There's been a lot of talk about predictions of retirements, what you took into account and what you didn't in terms of your forecasts. And I believe you identified the 2 facilities yesterday, and frankly I was writing too fast and didn't write them down. Which facilities have you considered as retiring for purposes of your analysis?
And so I think the question was around retirements that are occurring over the last, or the next couple of forward capacity auctions. And,
Right.
and those plants were Pilgrim and Bridgeport Harbor.
And why are you including first of all, why are you including those two?
But I think it is our opinion that we have, relatively certain that those plants are going to retire. So Pilgrim is a nuclear facility. Its license was not renewed. It's essentially retiring. It's not cleared for capacity auctions going forward. Bridgeport Harbor was the existing coal facility that is at the site where the Bridgeport Harbor 3 development facility is going. So it's going to retire around or right before the new generation facility comes in.
So you've only taken into account in terms of retirements for future auctions, the one that you are fundamentally certain are in fact going to retire.
That's correct. I mean, we do have, as we go out in time, we do have additional megawatts of capacity that are retiring. Those are the ones that are occurring in the next, the forward capacity auctions that we've seen in the next going forward.
And Millstone, which I think was the subject of the articles that Mr. McElroy showed you, that's the nuclear plant in Connecticut, right?
Correct.
That is now effectively going to be receiving a subsidy to stay open.
Yes, so they have won an award from the state for their clean energy attributes. I believe it's a 10-year contract. And that was a project that we identified at risk. We believed it was at risk. I think that Dominion, as owner of the facility, made no secret that the plant was at risk and would retire absent that contract that it received. So as we sit here today, I would say yes, it's safe to say it's no longer at risk of retirement because it received that contract.
And you haven't taken that facility's retirement into account in your analysis?
That's correct.
I think there's two different things going on here I want to understand. So in your analysis, you only took into account Pilgrim and Bridgeport Harbor as retiring.
Like in FCAs 10, 11, and 12.
Okay, because when you say CREC is needed in light of announced and at-risk plant retirements. Oh, I'm sorry. And this is page 6, second bullet on line 12. But CREC is needed in light of announced and at-risk plant retirements. The at-risk plant retirement scope in that statement includes what?
Okay, so that, yes, so announced retirements would be Pilgrim and Bridgeport Harbor. At-risk retirements is essentially that basket of capacity that the ISO New England, so basically when they say at-risk plant retirements, I'm referring to that basket of plants that ISO New England, as part of their self-report, have identified at risk. So those plants are not retiring as part of our baseline analysis.
So you're using it, though, as a term of art defined by ISO New England in terms of the list of plants?
Exactly.
Okay.
You gave us a number of factors that, in your opinion, support the proposition that Clear River is needed, irrespective of the fact that it doesn't have a CSO. One of the last things you talked about with Mr. McElroy was about a couple of the physical attributes of a plant like this. And you talked about fast start and dispatchable. What is fast start?
Fast start just relates to the ability to ramp up or to go from a certain level of output to increase your output over a 10-minute or a 30-minute time frame. So the ability to do that is an attribute to the market because they can call on that to basically help keep the market reliable through the ancillary service markets.
And you were talking.
And fast start is when the plant is already operating in some respect, as opposed to black start.
Yeah, so black start is separate, and black start is so particular facilities have to be capable of black start. That's a sort of separate cost-based ancillary product where the plant basically has the ability to start if it's sort of off the grid. I don't believe that Clear River
So
is
it's
flexible.
essentially the plant, everything's off. The turbines are not operating or whatever.
That's right.
And it can go from 0 to operating, providing power to the grid.
That's correct.
What is dispatchable?
What is dispatchable?
Dispatchable means that the plant has the ability to offer its output, its electricity, its megawatts into the market, and absent some outage, it has the ability to run when called upon. So the difference, the opposite of a dispatchable plant is what we would call an intermittent resource. And intermittent resources would be wind and solar that depend on the wind blowing or the sun shining. So they don't always have the ability to operate when called upon. If it's a cloudy day like today, the potential for solar to operate is severely diminished.
As if I understand, and actually I think it was in response to Coyte's questions, I may be wrong, but I believe what you were saying was that the attributes of fast start and dispatchability become even more important as the amount of renewable resources entering the market increase. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's because the market is relying to a greater degree on what are intermittent resources.
Correct.
That was your California example.
Yes.
So are fast start and dispatchable attributes, from your perspective, another aspect of why Clear River, both units, are needed, irrespective of the fact that it currently doesn't have a CSO?